Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. Kenneth Feinberg is a name that we have heard very often as usually under the term czar, special master. He is the man who has decided some of the compensation for the biggest cases in recent history, the 9/11, BP oil spill, Ken, the Boston Marathon mass shootings, even the CEO pay. I remember that very well, the TARP. The companies that got government money, you decide executive compensation. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you.
Glad to see you and glad to be here again today.
One of the reasons I was curious to talk to you is there's so many massive disasters that we have now where people start to talk about compensation. And from what you've learned, when are the times when people call on you? And when is it almost existential? Maui is in the news. Is that a case where there could be some call for mediation over who gets what?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I get the calls. Receiving a call is not the hard part. I receive calls after most tragedies and most disasters. The real issue that immediately comes up is there political consensus that there should be a special compensation fund created? I mean, bad things happen to good people every day. You don't have compensation funds. Is there a political consensus? And if there is, well, before I get involved, you have to ask the preliminary question: where is the money coming from if there's going to be a fund for eligible victims?
Well, and you've dealt with both. You've dealt with private sector, and of course public sector in terms of government money. Let's start with that word consensus. That is not a term that often links with political these days. Has that impacted, you think, victims and compensation that could be possible for some of these events?
Absolutely. I get a call usually when the President of the United States, Attorney General, the Congress, a governor, a judge, there is a sense that, in fact, the nature of the tragedy requires consideration of some sort of compensation. Only if you get over that hurdle do you get to the details. How much money? Who's eligible? When will the funds be dispensed? Is it a gift, or do you have to sign a release so you won't litigate if you accept the money? Those are all questions that quickly follow a political decision that we want to do something special for a very small number, relatively speaking, of victims.
So 9/11 was obviously, or September 11th fund was unique. We talked about TARP and the 2008 crisis, BP oil spill. Give me a sense of when things changed in your mind where that consensus perhaps broke down. Or maybe I don't want to be presumptuous. Maybe I don't want to be presumptuous. Good on challenging me there.
I will say this. 9/11 was very unique. 9/11 involved public taxpayer money. Now, these other examples that you give, like the BP oil spill, or perhaps Hawaii or some other tragedies, that doesn't involve public money. The 9/11 fund, the only time I think in American history where the taxpayer actually decided to foot the bill in paying the victims of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, the World Trade Center, the planes, and the Pentagon. All of these other tragedies that I've been involved in where there's compensation either involves insurance money, privately donated money, a corporate fund like the BP oil spill, the BP oil company that paid the freight in that compensation program, General Motors, the ignition switch compensation program. So you're right that 9/11 is really the high watermark for taxpayer money. But in these other programs, it's private, one private source or another to fund the bill. Now, Camp Lejeune, which is in the newspapers and on TV, advertising, lawyers, etc., that appears to be public money as well, appropriated by the United States. But those public programs, publicly funded, are very rare, I must say.
Now, with the mass shootings that I know you've been involved in compensation there too, where does the money come for that?
The funds in the mass shooting cases involve private donations, A, B, insurance money, or on occasion in the mass shootings, the federal government, knowing that it is being sued in court, decides to settle the case. And rather than litigate a responsibility for gun violence, has provided budgeted executive branch money to pay those claims.
Now, tell me if I'm getting outside your realm here, Ken, because one of the things I know in terms of the Purdue case, the Supreme Court is now taking a look at that case to see whether bankruptcy court is the right way to be coming up with essentially the funds. That's the mechanism through which the Sackler family has put aside $6 billion, which will be dispensed. Do you have any views on that, or would you prefer to remain neutral?
Oh, no. That's a very interesting issue that the Supreme Court's going to take. I mean, you can make a strong argument that the willingness of the Sackler family to contribute 4 times or more to a bankruptcy fund, Purdue, in order to compensate victims is justifiable, and that what they want in return for that money is a promise, legal promise, not to be sued again. That's why the Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether or not bankruptcy and a channeling injunction that would give the Sacklers protection, even though they're not bankrupts, is an appropriate use of the bankruptcy law, and that's going to be decided by the court.
Do you have a view on that, or
no? I don't really have a view. I will say this in light of your opening comments: using bankruptcy as a venue to resolve mass claims, J&J, Talc, Imra Cypress Talc, Georgia Pacific and Bestwall. Those cases where the bankruptcy court becomes the favored forum to resolve mass claims, highly controversial today, ultimately will have to be decided, I think, by the Supreme Court. And you can make strong arguments in favor and against in terms of using bankruptcy as the appropriate mechanism to provide certainty and speed in resolving mass litigation.
One of the interesting things about mass litigation is the U.S. has always been seen as a place where people can get highly compensated when they are injured. As more of these incidents take place, whether it's mass shooting, climate disasters in Maui, what impact does that have? Have you seen an impact? It would seem to me that the average amount of money that a victim would get would go down because more of these incidents are taking place, and there's got to be some consequences to that.
I
yes
don't know.
And no?
The plaintiff lawyers, very effective, very credible. They would say that the only realistic way to provide appropriate compensation for hundreds or thousands of victims is through some sort of mass litigation, whether it be a class action, whether it be bankruptcy. And that's because justice delayed is justice denied. And if you've got thousands of claims, there must be a way to aggregate the claims in order to process them quickly and efficiently and more fairly. Sometimes that is the case. Other times you'll get pushback from companies or the government that doesn't like the idea, but it's certainly viable. It's a credible way. And
Yeah.
I do think compensation in the United States for individual claimants is much, much greater than you would receive in any type of action in Europe or Asia or anywhere else in the world. The American legal system is unique in its compensating victims for mass tragedy.
Does the frequency of these tragedies, have you noticed it making a difference? I mean, let's take the mass shootings. It seems like there's a higher volume of them. Certainly aggregating the funds for the victims makes sense, but as we see more climate disaster, as we see more mass shootings, is that having an impact on what the remedies are?
Well, it's not having any impact that I can see on dollars.
Okay.
It is having an impact on what is the appropriate venue and forum for resolving mass claims. It used to be that if you had a mass disaster, you would file a class action, like back in the 1980s with Agent Orange and Vietnam veterans. And
which you were involved in, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right. The class action was the favored device. The Supreme Court, over the last 20 or 30 years, has restricted the use of the class action in the mass claims situation. And that's what I think has resulted in lawyers gravitating to the bankruptcy courts as a potential option for relatively speaking, speedy resolution and prompt compensation. Now, whether the bankruptcy courts were ever intended to be a forum for mass claims, that's an interesting issue. But again, I think the Supreme Court will have to decide that ultimately.
So, Ken, you're still called in many times when there's a crisis. Let's call in Ken Feinberg. There's a lot of discussion now around AI. No, you're irreplaceable, of course. But what role do you think, as we look at AI in terms of quantifying damages, dispensing remedies, does it give you pause to think about this being done by an algorithm?
Yes, it does give me pause. I always question the value of methodology or algorithm when what you really want to know is the pros and cons of victims, what they confront, the unique circumstances surrounding the tragedy. There's a big difference between a hurricane or a tsunami causing terrible death and injury versus a BP with or a 9/11 with his human fault. I'm dubious about taking the variables that go into an analysis of harm and victim impact and coming up with some sort of algorithm, as you say, that might be used as a substitute. You have all sorts of methodologies in mass claims, all sorts of them, but they are grounded in individual human consideration, how it will impact individuals. I'm a little dubious about AI and robotic, automatic assembly line calculations.
So let me switch to Maui right now and climate disasters. BP obviously was one. There was as you mentioned, there was a company that was clearly culpable, or multiple companies actually. What, in these situations where it's almost existential, act of God, certainly there's insurance to be dispensed. What do you think has changed? What advice do you have? Because there's a lot of people who have incurred a lot of damage, and there may be a quick.
Well, I think you've got to sit down, and when you start talking about mass damage, well, you have intimated, you have inferred some of the important questions. One, mass damage, who's responsible? Two, what are we talking about in terms of the political support for the creation of some sort of specialized fund. 3, even if you've got that political support, what is the source of the funds? 4, how much will the fund produce in the way of distribution to victims? 5, who are the victims? In Maui, I read, like you do on the front page, there are deaths, there are physically injured, there is property damage. I mean, there are all sorts of potential eligible victims. And you've got to begin to develop sort of a design architecture answering those questions step by step by step as you attempt to come up with a viable amount of money that will be available subject to rules, very transparent rules governing distribution, eligibility, amounts. You start doing that as soon as you think it's appropriate. But I must say, first and foremost, bad things happen to good people every day in this country. There's no fund. If you're going to have a fund, is there the political will? Is there the political consensus to develop such a fund because of the unique circumstances of the tragedy?
And it's hard to say sort of what has been the toughest decision making, but I'm curious what you say yes to now. When people come to you for guidance, for oversight, you get a lot of offers. What intrigues you? What's the best use of you?
Look, if our political leaders or our judges, if they believe that, I don't make that decision, if they believe that a fund should be created. Funds are very rare in this country. You're correct. They're more available today than they were 10 or 20 years ago. They're becoming a fashionable alternative to litigation.
Yeah.
But if our elected leaders or our judges come and say, Ken, we have decided already we want to create some sort of fund, then we begin to discuss the architecture, the design, how much money, who's eligible, what will be the procedures, and you begin down that road. So
anything else? One moment in your history that always fascinated me was deciding executive compensation. I spoke with you at the time about this. There is this divisiveness in the country, and I would love to capture how you thought about compensation, not necessarily commenting on the bank CEO compensation day, although I welcome that, but how did that frame your thinking around the appropriate level to pay the leaders in these situations?
You know, that is a very good question. When I was the pay czar and when the Secretary of the Treasury asked me to calculate or determine appropriate compensation for senior corporate executives, I learned a very valuable lesson. It's not about a corporate executive saying, well, if you pay me less than I deserve, I won't be able to take a vacation with my family, or I won't be able to buy an additional automobile, or my kids won't be able to go to private school. Those variables never enter into the discussion. What really is interesting is corporate officials believe many times that what they get paid is hard evidence of their self-worth. It's an amazing thing. When
most of us would beg to differ.
Dollars,
yeah.
When you say to a corporate executive, you're only going to make $1 million or $5 million because the government wants to make sure that you can at least remain in your post and finish the job. The emotional pushback that I receive, as if you're demeaning me, you're attacking my own self-worth and what I mean to my family and my community. That's every bit as emotional as the victim of a terrorist attack in 9/11. And I must say, it is a very difficult assignment, and that's why Congress made it clear that this was a rather unique assignment that would not be replicated.
It's
But the
sad. I
challenge
mean,
was to the
no,
challenge was to pay somebody, but keep them in their jobs so that the company could return to profitability.
any other advice you have as we're looking at the landscape that seems to have a lot of black swans, a lot of people getting hurt in various ways, always perhaps? You do have a playbook. We've talked a bit about that. And we do tend to sort of just freeze up and ricochet from crisis to crisis sometimes. Give us some thoughts as to what you would be thinking about as we look at the landscape of, frankly, a lot of disasters and a lot of pain out there, and how we compensate people appropriately.
Well, you better be careful about that. I've learned over the last 30 or 40 years that the American people have no interest in developing special compensation programs in advance of the disaster. It doesn't work that way. It's the emotion of a Maui or a BP oil spill or a 9/11 attack that triggers the desire, the political desire, to have these programs. And the other thing I think is that these programs should remain, if possible, exceedingly rare. This nation is built on self-reliance. People fend for themselves. They buy life insurance. They buy insurance to protect against the unforeseen. That's the American system. I don't think the American people see these special compensation programs like 9/11 as the wave of the future. I certainly don't, and I think they should remain relatively rare.
Great. Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.